break that the whole premise of the VCR is that that if we're going to have meaningful progressive conversations about issues of diversity, broadly speaking, or oppression, that I think it requires minimally two things: will and skill. And so the will means that we have a willingness to do it, that there's a kind of hardiness with a T that we have to bring forth to the process to do this, because it does require us to be hardy, T. And then the other piece has to do with skill. And so I don't really know of, I searched high and could find no models to suggest how do we position ourselves to have these conversations. And so this idea that seems to permeate our existence is, well, if you just get people together, then they can just talk. Well, it's almost impossible. And I just know when you're bringing people together, have these conversations without some attention to skill, without some kind of methodology, it's just a recipe for disaster. Which is why in our society we don't do it. We don't talk about these issues because we don't know how to. And because we don't know how to, we don't talk about them. And because we don't talk about them, we don't know how to. So we're stuck in that sort of recursive pattern. And so this VCR was intended to be that which allows us to sort of position ourselves to have these conversations. And so I'll walk you through it now. And as I just said to a group over lunch, that it'll seem so easy, you'll wonder, like, what's the big deal? But when you're thrust in the middle of it, you'll see what the big deal is. So what it says is that there are three pieces, there are three parts to the communication dialogue. So validate, challenge, and request. And to validate simply means that we find a way to see and acknowledge something redeemable in the other person. So right there, to me, that's a radical idea, because what happens is often, my experience is, that when someone comes at me with some strong kind of racist comment, that my blood gets boiling, and what I want to do is get them straight. I want to give them the facts, show them how they're wrong, show them how I'm right, all that good stuff that's bad for the interaction. And so with validation, so what I believe is that in these conversations, that one doesn't have the license or the right to challenge until one has appropriately validated. So that one does not have the right to challenge or confront, or if you want to use any of those other C's, like criticize, if you want to make this really negative, you don't have a right to do any of that stuff until you've appropriately validated. And that validation is not tantamount to agreement. It has nothing to do with agreement. So we should be able to validate we should be able to validate someone who is espousing things that are issues that are totally opposite of what we believe. We should be able to. And that when we're using the VCR, that it's a good idea to eradicate the word B-U-T from your language system. And what I would recommend instead is and. Because what happens is that anytime we attach but to anything that's affirming, the but happens to negate the affirmation. That was an interesting idea, but. So what happens is that one's ear, the recipient ear, just get trained to hear what follows the but because they feel like that's where the real message is. So, and this isn't just tactical. It's also, philosophical, because the idea is that if we're coming from this anti-oppression lens, then what we're really looking at is developing a philosophy of both and. So the VCR is never about taking away, it's about adding to. So I'm never trying to talk anyone out of what they believe or what their positions are. But I am engaged in a process that's inviting them to look at what else is connected to that. So with the VCR, and particularly when we're validating, I think it's also important to refrain from asking questions. Because questions oftentimes, and particularly for people like us, questions are disguised challenges. They're just challenged by another way. And those of us who are trained as therapists, we're really good at it. We're like the most wondering group on the planet. Well, I was wondering if, Well, I wonder if, and whatever follows the if is always a challenge. And so I said just refrain from questions, because questions, even if the intent is not the challenge, they get heard by the recipient as a challenge. And the other point of the VCR is that if I'm the dispenser of the validation, then I don't get to decide how long or how much validation to dispense. That it is the recipient of the validation who decides when there's enough validation. And I'll tell you why this is, because usually it's the person in the privileged position who is responsible for giving validation. And oftentimes what happens is that a validation will be given in a very cursory way to get it out of the way, to get to the real message. And the real message is always the one that slits the other person's throat. And so that I don't give a cursory validation to say, okay, I've done that, now we move to the challenge. I'm taking my cues from the other person. So here's some cues about situations where more validation rather than less validation is needed. So if we're participating in a conversation and I validate, and the tone and tenor and content of the conversation remains the same, more validation is needed rather than less. So if the person, it's kind of like what happens in our personal relationships with our partners, boos, whatever you want to call them. That the person says, you keep saying the same damn thing to me. I've heard you. How many times are you going to tell me? Well, part of the reason why the person keeps saying the same damn thing is because there's no indication that the damn thing they said has been heard. So that's going to continue to happen. That's going to continue to happen. So if I'm validating and the recipient is saying the same thing, that's my cue that somehow the validation is not connecting. And so some people then say, well, I validated and it didn't work, and then go back to what they used to do, which didn't work either, which is challenging. And so my thing is that what's needed in that moment is more validation rather than less. Okay? And so if I'm providing validation and there's a pushback, and as long as there's a pushback, it suggests to me more validation is needed. So when I provide a validation and the person receiving the validation doesn't push back, then I know that the validation has traction, and that is the point that we move from a V, this is what this is, to a C message. And so the C is challenge and confront. Now, what's difficult is that oftentimes the more passion we have connected to a topic area, the more urgent we are to move to a C. Because somehow we've been trained to believe that challenging somebody else somehow is effective. And it's never effective, because the more I'm challenged, the more I dig my heels into what I believe. And so it all depends on what your goal is for the relationship. And so so I don't think that starting with a challenge is helpful. And the key to the challenge is that it should ideally represent the flip side of the validation. So whatever I'm validating the person on, so if there's a person who has spoken up, and spoken up with a lot of passion, then I'm saying to that person that I appreciate your passion and you advocating for yourself. Then when I'm giving the person a challenge, it doesn't make sense to have the challenge be on something totally different. The challenge is on also the fact that and there's a way in which you express yourself that sometimes makes it difficult for me to stay connected to you, to stay in a relationship. So if the person values the validation, and what we say, if there's a yes set there, they agree with that, then the flip side of that is also about how you use your voice. So it's not about using your voice. It's not about not using your voice, but how you use it differently. So that so I might say to the person. So the person starts yelling and screaming. I will say that I really appreciate you exercising in your voice in a way that feels real for you. That basically you put it out there in a way that you felt that, and just appreciate you doing that. It gives me a chance to see how strongly you feel about these issues. Let's say that validation stuck with the person. Then my challenge would be, and there's a part of me that's worried about the way that the volume of your voice and the language you use sometimes will make it difficult for your voice to be heard. And I think the person is more receptive to hearing that second message if the holding takes place around the first message. And so that's the V, the C, and then this interaction should culminate with an R, which is a request. And the request is putting all this together. So here's my hope. My hope is that I think it would be wonderful if you could continue to exercise your voice in all the situations where you want to do that, and do that in a way that doesn't alienate other folks. Is this something that you'd be willing to try? Can you do this? Can you try whatever? So it culminates in a question, because the whole point of the VCR is like asking each of us to perform the work of a periodontist. It's asking us to perform a root canal. That what we want to do is take out the piece that hurts, but save the tooth. So we're not about extractions here. And so the piece that hurts is the piece we want to give them feedback on, the piece that gets in the way.